everyone, my name is Adrienne Dion and I am a Senior Product Manager at Wayfair. And I'm super excited to be here today to talk to you all about one of the most exciting, if not one of the most stressful times about being a product manager. And that's when it comes to deciding on whether to launch your product or feature. There are so many definitions of a product manager and everything that we are responsible for. But in almost every definition, you'll find something along the lines of delivery of features being included. And that's true, right? Our job is focused on solving customer problems and bringing those features and products to life. But there's a difference between launching features, launching the right features, and launching features the right way. There is so much that goes into product launches, and it's a continuous cycle. From ideation to planning and design to code reviews to feedback loops, it takes a lot of planning and coordination. Even the smallest of features can seem so simple, but have a really big impact if they are not done the right way or released too early. Now, I wish I was standing here today and giving you all a universal checklist that can be used for any product manager across any industry for any product, but that's simply just not the case. Even though you go through the same release cycle, the data, the code, the design, the problem you are solving is different every time. And that's why one of the reasons I love product management, the thrill of finally releasing a product to production and the opportunity to get to do that again and again. Now, that being said, not every feature is a total success and might not even be the problem or solving the problem you thought it would. I have to assume that most of you have sometimes felt like the everything is fine dog after something goes live at some point in your career. I know I certainly have. You think you're ready, you've announced a feature launch, you've done all the testing, and then boom, you release it and something goes wrong. And you, as the PM, you're in the center of everything that everyone turns to figure out what is happening, who is impacted, what's the impact, and what are we going to do next? So it's probably safe to say product managers do an exceptional job at playing it cool when everything is fine, but maybe even if it's not. So what plays into your decision to release, and how can you ensure it's successful? That's what I'm going to talk about with you all today, because a launch is so more than just identifying the right feature, writing and testing code, and pushing it to production. When I sat down to think about what makes product and features launches successful in my career, I boiled it down to 4 different buckets, and ensuring that there is always alignment with my team, identifying the risks, planning for failures, and having a strong post-launch follow-through. Now, I know I said every feature release is different, but if you make sure to incorporate these into your launch plan, you should feel confident in your decision when you finally get to push to production. So the first is creating alignment with your team and your stakeholders. From your business partners to designers to developers to analysts to your customers, there are a lot of people that are involved in the launch of a product. And I know you're probably thinking, sure, we hear this all the time, gaining alignment is the biggest part of our job. But truly, when you do this for product launches, it's critical in eliminating the element of surprise for your stakeholders. A great way to create alignment is getting them involved in the requirement gathering process. This will help them feel involved in the project, as well as give them the opportunity to provide input early. I do this in a lot of ways, and depending on the size of the product. Sometimes it's as simple as using a project brief that you can see here on the screen. That is usually more for straightforward features. I will fill it out, send it to them, ask them for feedback, questions, and make sure they have a general understanding of what is going to happen with this product, feature, or release. But what I want to make exceptionally clear here is to articulate the project rationale, the user story, define the requirements both in scope and out of scope, and as well as how we'll measure success. For more extensive features, I'll conduct things like a user story mapping session and have stakeholders come along for the ride to define that MVP. It feels like a lifetime ago that we actually used to be able to do this in an office all together, brainstorming, using a whiteboard, sticky notes. So that would have been my preferred method, but enter COVID-19. So now that we're all from home, a tool that I found really helpful to do this is called Miro. And it's a great tool that you can use online for cross-functional products. And you can do things like user journeys, wireframing prototypes, you can import documents, or even conduct retros. So if you haven't checked it out, definitely do, because this is a great way to align stakeholders and your technology team when building user journeys. In addition to requirements, you should also gain their buy-in for the design process. And I know this can sometimes feel tricky and it feels like you're inviting more cooks into the kitchen, especially when everybody has an opinion and feedback. But it can be especially important to get that input early to make sure that they, again, feel part of the process. For visuals, that also helps bring the feature or the product to life for our stakeholders. And when I show them these visuals, it's helpful to use data, rely on the creative brief, and your customer insights to show why you chose to do something or not another. This really helps to also target and focus these discussions to be the most productive. And don't forget to document. Documentation always feels super tedious, but I find that this is super helpful throughout the alignment process because it gives you something to refer back to. As a product manager, you're probably having the same conversation over and over with different stakeholders, asking the same questions. So being able to point people to one place where they can find everything that they need to know on the product or feature launch is super helpful and will just save you time. Also, communicate early and often. As product managers, things change on a dime. And just because you've gotten that initial alignment doesn't mean it's going to stay that way. You might realize that the scope has increased and that the project is going to be delayed, or there are dependencies that you didn't realize, and those are out of your control that you have to pivot. It's always better to communicate and keep these channels of communication open and transparent with your stakeholders. It's good to set and reset these expectations. A great way that I do that is using a public channel in Slack so that anybody can join and find updates or ask questions, drop in feedback to what the project is happening. But whether it's Slack or weekly email updates, I have found in my experience, over communication will never fail you. Next is to assess the risk and be okay with taking them. As a product manager, there's inherent risk in almost everything we do. So if you haven't yet, start getting comfortable being uncomfortable. And one way to mitigate risk when it comes to releasing features is having a solid test plan. But as a PM, we love data, and we use it to prioritize our roadmap, understand the success and value of features. But it can be easy too, as a product manager, to get caught up in the structure of those plans. Is it an A/B test, a pre versus post test? Do we have enough traffic volume? Is it running long enough? Because usually that's what the business wants to know. What's the impact? Now, revenue and conversion rates are probably two of the most common success metrics, but also the metrics that are noticeable the fastest when you launch a product or a feature. And anytime you say there's a possibility that this might negatively impact revenue, you might notice your stakeholders start to sit up a little bit straighter in their chair. But what about if you were trying to improve NPS scores or increase retention rates or customer satisfaction? What are the longer term metrics that you believe that this feature is truly going to move the needle on? If that's the case, and if you're looking to accomplish something like that, it might be willing to take an initial hit on revenue or conversion to actually improve those longer term metrics. Or maybe it's just something that you want to do that's better for the brand. And you think that no matter what, it's worth it to launch this because it's truly a better customer experience. That's your role as a PM, is to go back to your product vision and your product strategy and make sure that you're identifying the right metrics for the right feature. However, I would say in these situations, if you do believe it will negatively impact revenue or take a little bit of a hit, it's good to identify a threshold with your stakeholders so that you're aligned on if something might dip too low for the product or the business. And maybe sometimes the risk isn't in the financials, but it's actually in the customer experience. As PMs, we usually have stakeholders asking for everything in the kitchen sink, right? We want every bell and whistle. But really, you should pressure test that and really think and ask yourself and your stakeholders, do we need that extra bell? Do we need that extra whistle? Will it significantly change the outcome of the experience or the product? Can customers wait for it? Are they even expecting it? So what we hypothesize isn't always true. So you should feel empowered as a PM to pressure test those requirements and think through what really matters for the customer. I remember when I was launching my first product, one of the features that we wanted to add was to be able to save a personal credit card on file. And somehow this scope was much more than we anticipated, and it put the product launch date at risk. And at this time, we were actually pretty product driven. So that was a big thing that I actually had to consider. Do we launch on time or we don't launch with this feature? So I had a conversation with my tech team. We weighed kind of what we could do to try and make this possible, but it turns out there really wasn't much we could do without blowing the date. However, my rationale for launching the product on time without that feature boiled down to a couple things. And that was, hey, if we're launching this product feature and no one's ever using it, odds are they have to enter their credit card the first time when they're entering. And then when they come back, then they have to enter it again. That could actually maybe buy us a little bit more time to implement that work. And two, even though it might have been a little bit of a headache for customers to have to enter their credit card every time if they did come back before we had that feature ready, to me, it wasn't worth the risk of blowing our date from asking customers to pay for something. So the other area within the area within customer experience, and one I'm typically a little bit more comfortable playing risks in, is edge cases. I think we all know there's so many edge cases for every product and feature. And if we really sat down and we tried to cover each one, we would never launch our product or never launch our feature. And some are no-brainer. Some, those seem so rare and so minimal, yeah, that might never happen, so it's easy to shrug it off. But sometimes they might be a little bit more risky. And this is when I found it helpful to go out and collect user data to try and understand what percent of customers will this actually impact? What revenue do they drive? And really use that to weigh my options and weigh if I believe it's a risk edge case we can take or a risk we shouldn't. But then sometimes the business impact might be too high or your customer experience might be too poor. And that's just not something you want to launch with. And if that's the case, it's probably the right call to delay your product launch or feature. Whether it's a week or month, I'm sure the business will understand. Again, as long as you keep those communication channels open and transparent. And it's hard to determine when to take a risk, right? That's why it's called it a risk. But you know your product and your customer better than probably almost anybody. So if you can use those business metrics, understand your customer insights, and sometimes even sprinkle in a dash of your gut instinct, you should have the right formula to make an informed decision. And the third, a good product launch always requires you to prepare for failures, especially when you do decide to go forward and take a little bit more of a risk. Now, don't get me wrong. I wish every release went perfectly smooth, but I'd be lying to you if I said that was the case. No matter how much testing you did or how prepared you thought you were, there's always the chance that you launch something and something breaks. And this can be anything. It could degrade performance, it could ruin the UI, or it could prevent customers from logging in or checking out. Whatever it might be, it didn't go as planned and it needs to be fixed ASAP. For these situations, I found a few best practices that I've established so that I'm confident in how to respond if something does go wrong during a release. The first is setting and communicating an explicit release date and time with my development team and my stakeholders. This way, everyone is aware that a change is happening and also can help to give you extra eyes and ears on part of the site if you know it will be impacted with a release. Also, make sure your teams know when not to release. I think refraining from major product launches on Fridays are probably a most common practice, or maybe nothing past 4 p.m. because it's getting too late in the day and you won't have coverage. But I've also extended this to times throughout the day when I know maybe I have more volume than not, and it might not be the right time to introduce a feature. So thinking about the time of the day that you release is important to the success of your launch and something that you should be cognizant of. Second is to clearly define the customer group you are targeting so that you know who is seeing this product when it goes. This way, you also know who's impacted should something go wrong. For a previous product that I managed, we actually used Split as our release management platform. And there were a lot of reasons why we chose Split when it came to launching features. It really became a game changer for my team. Before Split, we had a homegrown solution of feature flags. So essentially, I could only turn things on and off for customers. And that was great for when we started. But as we grew and we had to figure out how to scale, we had to find something more sophisticated that will let us roll out features to different customer segments. And Split's UI made this possible and made it super easy for us to target those specific customer segments. We could target by location, we could target by their role, or specific stores if we really wanted to. I typically had a pretty good sense of who we should include in a feature launch. However, I always partnered with my analytics team, and they are a great resource to ensure you're capturing the right users at the right volume to get the results that you need. Also, when you're planning for your launch, it's helpful to designate a point of contact of who will be responsible for running communication. In my experience, it's typically been the lead developer on the project, but at times it's also been maybe a support engineer or a tech manager, someone that knows enough about the product or the feature that they're launching. I have been fortunate to work with teams that have been all hands on deck. Everyone jumps in to try and fix the problem should something go wrong. And that is super helpful. But it can also be super stressful and chaotic if you're trying to figure out what's wrong and how to communicate that out. So having someone designed to run point with you as a product manager and be your partner in crime for those situations is extremely beneficial for product launches. And decide finally how to roll back a feature or disable it should it go wrong. If you haven't experienced the sheer feeling of panic when you release something and it breaks something else on the site, consider yourself lucky. In these moments, you don't even care what went wrong. You just need to figure out how to turn it back and how to make it pretend like it didn't even happen. In some cases, it might be easy as a click of a button, but in others, it might be a little bit more complex. I remember one time my team and I made a change and it was through the database. And that is something that is not as easy to roll back. And I will never forget the scramble and the time it took us to figure out how to revert that change. I remember it so vividly that I will never again launch a feature without knowing exactly what our rollback plan will be, no matter what the size of the feature that I launch. So I mentioned that I use Split, and another reason why I love Split is the simplicity of the UI and how easy they make it for technical and even non-technical folks to control, manage, and turn features on and off. One of the features that I love, and while I've only had to use it a few times, it's always worked, is what they call a kill button. So the kill switch will instantly kill a feature in production. And as I said, I haven't had to use it often, but I can use it anytime, anywhere, and it immediately turns off and disables the feature without having to roll back code. This has saved me and my team from having serious impacts to features that launched that didn't go as planned. So my takeaway on this one is when you're closing in on launching your product or your feature, make sure you don't plan just for success, but you plan for failure to help you minimize that impact. This way, you can keep calm, ship it, and you'll be prepared to respond no matter how the outcome is. And finally, don't forget to think beyond the launch. Spend time thinking about what happens next, because a successful release doesn't just stop when it goes to production. Yes, at this time, the bulk of the work might be done, but really, this is when you get to test your hypothesis and put it in front of the true judge, your customer. Sometimes you might have to wait a few weeks for a test to gain significance, or sometimes it's pretty clear right away if it's going well or if it's not. But remember, go back to the metrics that you define that would measure success in the beginning before deeming it a win or a loss. And when you get the chance, share those results. I remember the first time I launched a feature and a developer asked me, "Hey, whatever happened to that feature? Is anyone using it?" And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, I can't believe I never followed back up with him and let him know how the feature performed. High visibility features, or when you're launching a new product, those ones are easy to keep tabs on and ones that everybody wants to know about. However, the smaller things or the low-hanging fruit can sometimes get lost in the day-to-day of moving on to the next best thing. I found it helpful to set up a monthly review meeting with my analytics, my stakeholders, and my technology team, so it's a constant reminder to do a little bit deeper dive into all that we've accomplished. And also, set up feedback loops and be ready for feedback, especially if you took a risk with your MVP. This is the best way to get qualitative data, and you can pair that with the quantitative data from your test. Feedback can also help you prove or disprove assumptions and tell you why, which numbers always can't. And I find that you don't want to just do this with your customers, but also your stakeholders too. What is the sales team hearing? What is your customer support team hearing? Are they answering the same questions? Are they answering new questions? Has it has it eliminated the problem altogether? Whether it's a meeting or maybe a Slack channel, a Trello board, establish an avenue that stakeholders can escalate these questions and concerns to. This also helps you in your iteration process to understand what you can pull in next, because sometimes you think you might need to move on to the next thing when really there's no need for it. And finally, reflect. I always set up retros to understand what went well and what didn't so that we can learn from the next time. I like to do these probably a week, maybe 2 after a launch so that you can ensure it's fresh. And I also like to make sure I include my stakeholders, not just the development team. This way, it's inclusive of the entire process. And if you missed anything in the planning phase, you can incorporate that for the next time. Specifically, for when things don't go as planned, I like to use the 5 whys technique. This really helps my team get to the root of the problem and go beyond the surface level of what happened. And what you do is you ask kind of why. They say on average, you get to about 5, again, to understand if it's a systemic problem or maybe it was just a miss. However, it's also easy in retros to focus on what didn't go well and how you can improve. And that's great. And it's always good to be continuously learning and iterating. But also, as the PM, make sure you step in and try and figure out what went well too, because that's also helpful. You want to know what your development team responded well to or what your stakeholders thought was really beneficial, because that way you can incorporate that the next time too. And so then, after all this time, after all the planning and potentially blood, sweat, and sometimes maybe even tears, don't forget to celebrate. All too often, we get right back to the roadmap, we look at the next thing on the list and get right back into things. But focus on what went well and celebrate with that team, especially with big milestones. It will be really important for you and your team. So what I love most about product management is the opportunity to work with so many different teams to solve customer problems that sometimes they didn't even know they had. I've had a lot of fun along the way, a lot of stressful days, a lot of wins, and even a lot of losses. But every success and every failure, I've learned something for the next time. So hopefully today, I gave you some tools and tips that you can use in your next product launch. Because sometimes the question is to release or not to release. It's simply when.